Right now we're going to talk about Iowa native John Wayne with Herb Fagen. Herb is the author of a new book called Duke, We're Glad We Knew You. And it's a little different perspective on John Wayne's life. Herb, welcome to WHO Radio.
Well, it's nice to be on your show. Thank you very much.
How is this different from some of the other biographies that have been written on John Wayne?
Well, this book is largely based on extensive interviews of people that I have spoken with and have gotten to know that have given me remarkably good and funny and touching and lovely stories about this bigger-than-life human being and great motion picture star.
Many of these are actors who worked with him on screen.
Oh, yes.
You even have his stepsister. You've interviewed John Wayne's stepsister. And all of them really praising the Duke, right?
Well, he was, yes. Everybody that I have spoken to has enormous respect for the man. They might not have always agreed with him, but enormous respect for him and his professionalism and what they consider to be a very decent human being.
Yeah. Let's just start out by talking about some of the things you learned about him. For example, Van Harden wanted to make sure that I ask you about his birth weight. When he was born here in Iowa, the rumor is that he was very large.
He was 13 pounds.
13 pounds. Oh, my gosh.
So he was a bit of trouble for his mother.
Yeah, his poor mom.
Who was a little woman. She was only about 5 feet, 5'1".
Oh, my.
Molly Brown.
And one of the interesting things I found in your book is that they changed his middle name when he was about 5 years old. He was born with the middle name Robert. Right, and when his younger brother was born, the mother decided... the mother didn't like Duke that much, and the story has it is because the delivery was extremely hard. And she you're saying she didn't like her son that much?
No, she didn't like Duke that much. From what I understand, that it was not a happy marriage between Duke and between his mother and his father, and Duke was clearly Daddy's boy. I mean,
right.
Clyde and Duke had a wonderful relationship, but I guess because when Bobby was born, they changed it and they named him, changed it to Michael.
So they took John Wayne's middle name and gave it to his brother.
That's right.
That's interesting that his mother didn't seem to appreciate him or care for him that much. I certainly get in the book that his dad was a big supporter, and he and his dad hung around together. His dad was a pharmacist. Mm-hmm. Do you think the fact that his mom didn't show him a lot of encouragement affected his life in any way?
Well, I'm not too much into psychological or what I call psychobabble, but I would imagine certainly it could not have helped but affected his life. On the other hand, he always tried to be very good to his mother. He never publicly said anything derogatory about his mother. This I've heard from other people and people that knew him well. And also that even after his stepmother remarried, and he could never seem to, his mother remarried, he could never really seem to please her, that he was always sending her on vacations, always doing whatever he could as a dutiful son. He was that kind of person.
So even when he became a big star, she didn't seem to be that excited about him?
It doesn't seem that way.
No. He moved to California when he was about 7 years old.
Right.
His dad actually moved ahead, I think you said, for about a year.
That's right.
So he was without his dad for about a year.
Yeah.
And then he got out to California. Is that where he got the name Duke?
Yeah, well, originally they went out to the Mojave Desert. They lived in a place called Lancaster, and Clyde bought some land, and they tried a homestead, and it just didn't work. And he couldn't really make a very good living. So finally they decided, or at least Molly, Duke's mother, decided that if they didn't get out of there, she was going to leave his father, and they moved to Glendale. And it was at Glendale that he was really molded young Marion Morrison. And what happened is that he had a pet Airedale by the name of Duke, and he used to walk the pet Airedale to school, and he'd go by the firehouse every day, and the firemen would be out there, and they'd say, well, here comes Big Duke and Little Duke. And Big Duke was the Airedale, and Little Duke was Duke, and Little was dropped, and he became Duke, and he always went through his life as Duke.
So nobody really called him Marion then?
Well, they did at the beginning, and he never liked that name at all, and he would get in fights about it. His mother even called him Skinny sometimes because he drove a mare to school. He kind of rode it, a very thin, emaciated mare, and he hated that name, too. So when he got Duke, before he actually got Duke, he just had his friends call him Morrison. He didn't like Marion at all.
But that's one of the funny things about this, and you get this in a Trivial Pursuit question or something, the fact that this big, rugged, tall cowboy had the name of Marion. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't seem to gel, doesn't seem to fit.
Well, I guess the filmmakers never thought so either, because they quickly changed it to John Wayne in 1930.
Did everybody call him Duke, or only his close friends?
No, he was pretty well known all over the film industry as Duke. If someone called him John, they didn't know him very well. One of the interesting things is when he formed his own production company, and all of a sudden people are always calling him Duke, didn't know they should call him Mr. Wayne once he got in the production end of it. But he was a little bemused by all that, and he was Duke.
I've also heard said that he was not in the service, but you point out in your book that he did apply to Annapolis.
Yeah.
And was turned down.
Yeah, he applied to Annapolis after high school. You know, he was an all-state football player at Glendale High School, and he did not get the appointment. And then he went to Southern California on a football scholarship. His father, Clyde, really wanted him to go into the military academy.
But they just didn't accept him. So
he came close, but he did not get the appointment.
So he tried. So anybody who criticizes him for saying he wasn't in the military, well, he tried.
Well, he tried, and also the fact that during World War II, and this is, I try to get this just from the people that knew him, that I talked to, he was also 38 years old and had 4 kids.
By that time, by the war.
Yeah.
He was a college honor student. He studied pre-law. He was much more intellectual than probably most people would guess, right?
I've had people tell me that he's one of the brightest people they knew in Hollywood, and he was also very well read. Marlene Dietrich once made a statement out of the guy, because she, of course, liked him, but that he never read a book. That's totally false. He read from the time he was in high school. He devoured biographies, and he even won a Shakespearean oration at Glendale High School. So this guy was smart. He
also played chess. If I remember, you mentioned that he's on the set and playing chess and beat a lot of people.
Oh, nobody could beat him.
Yeah,
nobody could beat him. He was a master. Also at bridge. Also at Hearts.
Well, most people couldn't beat him. I remember your story about Chris Mitchum, Robert Mitchum's son. He said that when he first was in a movie with John Wayne, that they sat down. One of Duke's little things seemed to be like to play chess with you to see what kind of person you were. And he sat down and intentionally started to cheat when he was playing with Chris Mitchum. And he'd move pieces that he wasn't supposed to move and stuff like that. And the first time, Chris Mitchum didn't say anything because he was afraid. This was John Wayne. And he ended up talking to somebody else afterwards, and Chris Mitchum said, John Wayne cheats when he plays chess. And they told him, hey, he's waiting to see what kind of reaction you give. He knows if you've got guts, if you actually step up and say something. So the second time he played him, he actually did point out that the Duke was cheating, and the Duke said something like, well, how come it's taking you so long to point it out?
Yeah, well, I've got to know Chris pretty well. He wrote the foreword to another book I did called White Hats and Silver Spurs, and the fellow that mentioned that was a very nice guy I've gotten to know quite well, and also a fine character actor by the name of Edward Faulkner. He was the other one. And they played an awful lot of chess. Chris could beat Duke once in a while. Ed Faulkner never did, maybe one time in 100 games, but he was a steady chess partner.
Our guest is Herb Fagen, the author of the book Duke. We're glad we knew you. You mentioned earlier that his parents did divorce. I think he was in his early 20s when they divorced.
His father married a very lovely woman who, by the name of Florence Buck, and Duke was almost like a son to her. And one of the most heartwarming stories that was told to me by Duke's sister Nancy, but also Nancy's girlfriend at the time, Jeanette Briggs, who later became Jeanette Mazurki, married Mike Mazurki, was that John Wayne continued to correspond with Nancy.
His
Nancy's mother,
his stepmother.
After Clyde was gone and paid for operations and all that, he was quite devoted.
So he devoted himself even to his stepmother.
Absolutely.
And that was very special about
him. And that's a lot of things. People don't seem to realize that about John Wayne, was his loyalty and also his kindness, and also a word that people don't want to hear, but his sensitivity. He had an innate sensitivity.
What else did his stepsister say about him?
Well, she elaborated very much upon the loving relationship between John Wayne and his father, and a very touching story about when that Clyde, her stepfather, had driven her to school, said he wasn't feeling good, went home, and he died that very day. And then Nancy's mother picked Nancy up at school with Duke, and Duke just held Nancy, and they cried.
How was he different from his on-screen image? We think of him as the big, tough guy. Is that the way he was?
He was. He was tough, I think, in a lot of the best sense of the term, but he was also a sensitive man, and he was also a kind man, and he was also a vulnerable man. And I think sometimes reviewers, at least early on, tended to neglect that. It was somewhere in between, but pretty much what you saw on the screen is largely what you got. I mean, he had that kind of presence, and he had that kind of presence whether he was on a screen or whether he was in person.
He, of course, was known as a gung-ho patriot. And his films reflected that. And in person, he was really like that?
Yeah, he was a conservative Republican at a time when that wasn't particularly in vogue. And from what a number of the people that I interviewed said and mentioned is they feel that cost him some well-deserved Academy Award nominations.
Well, it was also interesting to read that some of the actors in the book mentioned that they feel that they lost roles in other movies because they dared to be in a John Wayne movie.
Well, that was told to me by Chris Mitchum, and I know Chris pretty well. We've talked about a lot of things, and that's definitely true. Chris had a nice career going. He did Chisholm, and he did Big Jake, and then he read for Steelyard Blues with Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland. And as soon as he got there and they looked at his resume, they kind of backed off, and he asked him why, and he said, well, thanks for coming. And he asked him why, and he said, well, this is with Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland. And Chris said, so what? And he said, well, they might be talking politics. And Chris said, so what? I can think for myself. I almost have a degree in English literature. And they said, well, you worked with John Wayne in 3 movies. And he said, so what? And they said, well, we don't think you're, right for the role. And Chris at that time was voted Photoplay's top male prospect for the year. I think it was 1971 or 72. And that's the truth. In Chris's case, that is the truth. And Chris says that. This is not what I'm saying. And this, I might add, was not something that he just simply said. It's something when I asked him about John Wayne, he said that this had happened to him.
Yeah. Speaking of John Wayne and his conservative nature, his all-American look, at the same time, he had multiple marriages. He was known for using lots of bad language.
Yeah.
He was a strong smoker and drinker. How does that fit?
Well, I think within the context of the times, when we say multiple marriages, we're talking about 3 marriages, but he was very much of a family guy. He was not what you would call a player among Hollywood leading men. Marriage was something he took quite seriously until, the marriage started dissolving. So he did not have this string of scandals or affairs or anything like that. And he did raise 2 separate families. And I've been fortunate enough to meet a number of his kids from both the families, but he does have 7 kids and something like 20. He did have 21 grandkids. The smoking and the drinking, I think, were a part of that era, and certainly with the smoking, he paid a price. With the drinking, he was not an alcoholic, but these guys were hellraisers. There was no 2 ways about it. Like somebody said, when they go out to Monument Valley and sit around all the time, that's about what there is to do. He could drink pretty well.
He was known for his colorful language, too, and...
yeah. But not on the screen. You see that?
No, not on the screen. But that's what I'm saying is how does that image gel? On the screen, he was very careful, but at the same time, especially when he directed a movie, I mean, he really would burst into some tirades and profanities.
Well, he had a temper. But he was funny too that way. He didn't swear. He didn't like to swear anyhow in front of women. This was kind of, I think, within the context of the time, and I think a lot of people have used salty language. I've been known to use it myself, but I don't think anyone could ever read a word that I wrote, with a 4-letter expletive. So I don't think that's terribly inconsistent.
On his deathbed, he converted to Catholicism.
Yes, he did.
And I've never really heard why.
Well, I think for one, to please his first wife, Josephine. That was always an issue between them. I think to please his kids. And I tend to feel that he did have a certain spirituality about him, and that he wanted to be buried as a Roman Catholic.
Because I remember hearing that, and then I read it again in your book, and that surprised me a little bit, that as he knew he was dying there in the hospital, he called for a priest to come in and baptize him.
I think he felt that was one of the sources of separation between he and his wife, Josie, who he always loved, but she was a very strict Roman Catholic, and he wasn't, and their 2 worlds were so completely different. He never felt good about divorcing Josie. He never really did.
In this book, Herb, you talk with many stars and children of stars. How is their life different from those of us who are what I call maybe the normal everyday people? Because most of the people in this book didn't have normal upbringings.
No.
They were either stars or they were children of big stars who were in movies all the time. Did they turn out differently? Is their lifestyle different?
Well, what I've been able to find is so many of the people that made the Westerns are pretty solid people. I think their problems in life had been drinking, and a lot of them were heavy drinkers. I don't know if they turned out differently. I think everybody who has been in this kind of industry has had their personal problems. You know, it's a very fickle industry, but I found a surprising level of stability among the people that I spoke with. Of course, a lot of them were from the older schools, and Chris Mitchum came up differently. You know, he shunned the professions. Michelle Mazurki, Mike Mazurki's daughter, just always wanted to be involved with pictures, and she's a successful talent agent today. So the people that I talked to, I would say, no, I have talked to many people in the film industry that have been affected very adversely, especially many of those child stars. Lee Aker had his problems, you know, and Lee admitted that candidly.
But as you interview people for the book, or let's say for articles in Classic Images magazine, are they in any way bitter about their Hollywood background?
I think some of the only ones that somehow are a little bitter are the child stars of that were in the sitcoms during the 50s and the 60s. You know, a good many, a highly disproportionate amount of them have gone on drugs and did go on drugs, and of course have cleaned up their act, but it took a toll on them. The older stars, no, it was a different industry in those days for them.
Yeah. Herb Fagen is the author of the book Duke, We're Glad We Knew You, and you mentioned in the book that John Wayne is buried in an unmarked grave.
That's right, and the family did not want the grave to become some kind of a national shrine like, Elvis's graveside, and they deliberately did not want this turned into a circus.
And was that his choice or the family's choice?
I think it was probably the family's choice. I don't know. I have no evidence that he actually said it. No, I think this was the will of the family.
Now his sons are carrying on some of his tradition.
Oh, sure. I was just at the Golden Booth this year. I covered that, in fact, for Classic Images. That's the Western Academy Awards. It was at the Century Plaza Hotel, and the whole family was there. Michael is head CEO of Backjack today, and that's the John Wayne production company.
Yeah.
And the rest of the Wayne kids were there, and they're keeping up the legend and the legacy, certainly, and with a great deal of pride, I might add.
Well, he was a consummate professional, though. Herb Fagen, the book Duke, We're Glad We Knew You. Thanks for being with us. And so we'll spend a few minutes talking about an Iowa native, a real man. He was a football player as well. The Duke, John Wayne. Our guest is Ronald Davis. He's a history professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, and he's the author of a new book called Duke, The Life and Image of John Wayne. And Ronald, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Steve.
You were up here in Winterset to do a little research for the book, and tell us your impression up here as you were doing some research on the book.
Well, it's a very interesting area, and I love driving down the main drag, which is named after John Wayne, and seeing the birthplace of John Wayne, and then the Historical Society there was very helpful to me in writing the book.
Did you get a chance to talk to anyone who had any recollection of him being here?
Fortunately, there were a lot of newspaper interviews that had been done, and the library there had those on file, so I was able to get some comments from people who knew Wayne.
Right.
Needless to say, he left Iowa when he was like 6 or 7 years old. We're going back in time.
Yeah, he lived in Winterset for like 3 years, and then Earlham for 3 years, and then he lived in Des Moines for like a little period of time when his dad moved to California first.
Right.
And then by the age 7, he was out there in California. And I was surprised to read in your book that he really has almost no recollection of Iowa whatsoever.
No, well, I think he wouldn't at that age. He heard stories about the West and the vanishing frontier and that sort of thing, which probably his parents continued to tell him, so he had some recollection in that respect.
Now, why another book on John Wayne? And to be honest with you, there got to be like 15 or 20 books.
There are lots of books
on
John Wayne.
So why did you need to write another one?
Well, I wanted to do one that took a historical treatment of him that would try to be fair, because there have been some others that I think were not fair to him. I mean, Wayne was a man of strong political convictions, and so you can get people who will take their particular slant in terms of analyzing him, and I was trying to take an objective point of view, not only from the standpoint of the movie fan, but also asking the question, why has he become this great American icon?
Right.
I mean, it's interesting, almost 20 years after his death, he's still very much with us. I mean, my undergraduates, for example, probably would be hard-pressed to name a movie that Clark Gable was in other than Gone with the Wind, but they can name John Wayne movies forever.
Right. And just a couple of years ago, there was a poll that came out that showed that John Wayne was still America's all-time favorite movie star, even in the 90s.
Yeah. And really, in some ways, Steve, even more than a movie star. When I take my walk around my neighborhood in Dallas, there's a van in the next block that has the bumper sticker, "God bless John Wayne." You know, he's really transcended into something that's an American symbol.
Yeah, he symbolized something. He symbolized American, didn't he? Hero. Yeah. He was a hero, but the thing is, I think your point makes the book makes the point that is that a lot of this was just a Hollywood image. He was not the type of guy. As a matter of fact, he never fought in a war. He never shot guns as an adult. He was just playing a part, right?
Right, and he was a sensitive guy in many regards. He had his insecurities, to be sure. He had his insecurities where women were concerned because of his rather turbulent relationship with his mother. He was sensitive to the fact that he hadn't fought in World War II. Earlier biographers have accused him of being a draft dodger, which I don't go with. There were some very valid reasons why he was out of that war, namely that he was the upper limit of draft age, had 4 children. And, of course, the studios were doing their best to convince him that, hey, you can do more good for the morale of the country by making these war movies.
Yeah. Our guest is Ronald Davis. The book is called Duke, The Life and Image of John Wayne. And he did many interviews, some with some people who had never really talked much about John Wayne before. And I think that's the real strength of this book, Ronald, is that you actually talked to John Wayne's widow, to Maureen O'Hara, and a number of other people, right?
Yes, right. Well, I mean, what an experience to spend time with both of those ladies. Maureen O'Hara, of course, was Duke's favorite leading lady. I asked her, you know, how'd you get along with John Ford and John Wayne and these macho guys? She said, oh, they considered me one of the boys, you know. I mean, they wanted her to go beer drinking with them and that sort of thing. Feminine, beautiful woman though she was, she could hold her own with that tough gang.
Well, I was surprised to see how close she was to him. She even visited him like the weekend before he died or something. I mean, she was that close all through the years.
You know, she said that people often think that they had some kind of a romance. She said, no way. Duke was very fond of her husband, Charlie Blair, and when she and Charlie lived in the Virgin Islands, well, Duke would come down and play chess with Charlie Blair, and he could sit around without his toupee on, and she'd fix steak for him 3 times a day, which was his preference. And they went island hopping one day, and Charlie was an aviation pioneer. They went island hopping one day, and I believe it was Puerto Rico. The civil aeronautics was getting pretty testy because they didn't have a co-pilot. And Charlie says, oh, come on, guys, you know John Wayne. You've seen The High and the Mighty. Of course, Duke couldn't fly anything.
You interviewed Gene Autry as part of this whole book, and what was that like to interview a legend like Gene Autry?
Well, I've, for the last 25 years, headed the oral history program at SMU on the performing arts, so I've had the great good fortune to interview something like 500 celebrities from the film industry, and Gene Autry certainly is one of the great ones. He and Wayne were both under contract to Republic. In fact, they were making, at the same time, Republic's first 2 films. And so they knew each other. They were friends. They were not great close friends, but they certainly knew each other around the lot. And you may recall that early in Wayne's career, they tried to turn him into a singing cowboy.
Right.
He was singing Sandy.
Right.
And I think, fortunately for Duke and probably for the world, he eventually turned that over to Gene Autry, who could do a much better job.
One of the criticisms is that he wasn't really a great actor. I've heard this from some people, that he was certainly a character and a hero, but he wasn't a great actor. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, I think he was a far better actor than most critics gave him credit for. I mean, if you look at The Searchers, he's fabulous in that. I mean, his Academy Award-winning role in True Grit is great. I like it a lot, but The Searchers is by far my favorite John Wayne portrayal, and it has many dimensions to it.
Well, the book is filled with all sorts of interesting stories, and we can do a little analysis of how Iowa impacted his life. Talks about his private life, the split in the family, how the relatives ended up kind of fighting over him after he died. Lots of interesting information from Ronald Davis in the book Duke, The Life and Image of John Wayne.